And so I want to move into a discussion of Peter Sloterdijk's essay that he wrote in 1999, and which was published in the German newspaper Die Zeit, and which caused a bit of a controversy. It's what we might classify in the tradition of dangerous essays or dangerous thoughts of the kind that we have come to expect from Plato and Nietzsche and so forth, the great, truly dangerous minds in the Western tradition. I think that Sloterdijk has revealed himself with this text as a dangerous thinker, and I think that when the text came out in 1999, the controversy was not much ado about nothing. There's definitely a reason for it. It was the essay, of course, Rules for the Human Park, which is subtitled A Response to Heidegger's Letter on Humanism, that Habermas condemned or attacked, rather, Sloterdijk for writing. And we'll see why as the text unfolds here. So I want to discuss it. Now it's called Rules for the Human Zoo, and the rules will refer to how, whether, and who the politicians or who the shepherd or whatever the figure is that happens to be in charge of a civilization, the rules that are implemented for comporting and taming human beings within the contemporary zoo. And so it deliberately casts the human being, as we'll see, in the role of an animal. First of all, the first thing he does is he starts off by saying that books are letters to friends. This is basically what they are in the humanistic tradition. They're thick missives that are sent, that are written by authors in almost as though they were letters, and that are sent to an unknown audience. Heidegger had said in the Letter on Humanism that humanism originated with the Romans, and that the Romans received it from the Greeks during their Hellenistic phase, that is to say, from their decadent period. And so he wants to give it this negative stamp because Heidegger in the Letter on Humanism specifically condemns humanism, more or less. He wants to do away with it. So Sloterdijk begins by saying, well, the Romans were the friends that the Greeks, they didn't know who were going to receive the letters of their philosophical texts. And one doesn't know when one writes a book. It's like a letter hurled out into thin air. You don't know who's going to catch it. And in this case, it was the Romans who caught it and established the humanistic tradition that was then revived in the Renaissance, and in which we see synopsized at best in texts like Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man, that puts man at the center of the universe with all the divine beings above him and the animals and plants and stones below him. Man is in the center of creation in this tradition, this humanistic tradition, and he is also the rational animal. So texts are these letters that are sent by an author, and one doesn't know who's going to receive them, and in this case it was the Romans. Now, the thing about it is that the Romans, the humanistic tradition today is basically that the nation is the heir of, it's crumbled and it's completely in ruins, but as it exists and has existed is the idea of a canon of literary texts that have come into being, like Benedict Anderson's imaginary communities, in which one has a canon of texts in a nation state, and everybody within that state reads the same texts, and it creates a nation state based on a textual identity in which there is a cultural elite who reads the same text, and that gives the nation a sense of its sense of identity. That was true down to 1945, to the end of World War II. But long about World War I, new media came in, first with World War I radio, and then later in mid-century television, and nowadays the internet. And these new media ruptured the humanistic tradition so that now it creates mass culture. So we have this idea of mass culture now, which is basically an anathema to the humanistic tradition of the cultivated, literate individual who reads books that have a civilizing effect on him. And so we have this issue that the texts the texts in the humanistic tradition have a taming effect upon the individual. There's an aspect that the humanistic tradition is opposed to the barbaric. The barbarian. The barbarian is one who is uncivilized and given to bestiality and violence. But in the humanistic tradition, one humanizes by reading the right texts. And reading the right texts civilizes one and domesticates and tames the human being so that you know how to behave in a civilized society. But now, of course, with the mass culture industry coming in, we're in a post-literate age, and therefore also a post-humanistic age, and therefore also we have the problem now of another type of media coming in, which Sloterdijk designates as disinhibiting media. This is to say that most of our media, our movies and video games and sports arenas and so forth, have a tendency to bring out the worst aspects of the human being. Rather than civilizing him or taming him, they intend to encourage his bestiality. They bring out the worst in him. The Romans had the same problem. Opposed to the humanistic tradition that they inherited from the Greeks on the one hand, which tames and constrains the human being, there was also the gladiatorial arenas and the amphitheaters and the hippodrome on the other hand, and these were disinhibiting in the sense that they removed the repressors on one's tendency toward violence, and the society gradually geared itself down into violence as disinhibiting media took the stage. The book lost the competition, humanism disappeared, and Sloterdijk sees the same process happening again today. The humanistic tradition is in ruins. It's been taken over by the disinhibiting media of the media circus, the videodrome, as David Cronenberg calls it in this film, that have now taken center stage and have a very bad effect on taming the human being. In fact, they don't tame the human being at all. They simply bring out his bestial elements. And as a result, we get the rise in crime. We get schools, especially in America, where now we have to have metal detectors to protect the teachers against students that are coming into the classroom. Who knows whether they'll have guns with them. And so the traditional humanistic tradition itself has broken down. It isn't working. And so the old tradition that the texts of humanism tame the human being isn't working anymore. The disinhibiting media are winning. The book is giving way to the sports stadium. Same thing as happened with the Romans. And so this is the little preface to the essay, and then he moves into a discussion proper of Heidegger. This sets the stage for Heidegger's letter on humanism, in which Sloterdijk characterizes him in the following terms. Heidegger wrote his letter on humanism in an epistolary style, as a kind of letter, as the title says, letter on humanism, to Jean Beaufray, who was a French individual who was interested in his response to whether and how humanism should be saved. And so he sent Heidegger this letter, and Heidegger responded with the essay in which he said, well, now the problem is you're asking to what degree humanism should be saved already betrays that the word itself has lost its meaning. And there's also an issue about whether humanism is something that we need to retain. Heidegger didn't believe that humanism was something that should be retained. He wanted to put into place his kind of ontoanthropology of being in place of humanism. For him, the problem with the humanistic tradition was precisely that it led to the atrocities of the 20th century. The humanistic tradition, as he characterizes it in that letter that comes from the Romans, was revived in the Renaissance, is the tradition that places man as the rational animal at the center of all things. But the problem with this for Heidegger is that the human being is in no sense a rational animal. The human being is not an animal at all. That's the problem with the humanistic tradition. For Heidegger, there's an abyss of difference between the human being and the animal insofar as the human being has a world and creates and makes a world out of language. Language is the house of being, he says in this letter on humanism. It is the house of being. And the human being constructs this world out of the bricks and mortar of language. Animals don't have this. The animal is poor in world, as he writes in his lecture cycle on world finitude and solitude. The human being is poor, or rather the animal is poor in world. The stone doesn't have a world at all. The stone's not even in a world, and presumably the same for the plant. The animal is poor in world, but the human being has and makes a world. That is to say, ethnically constructed worlds that are built together out of, to realize certain intuitions of being out of the bricks and mortar of language. That's the humanistic tradition. And the problem is that, or that's Heidegger's critique of the humanistic tradition, and the problem is then that humanism sees man as a rational animal, simply as this animal to which a spiritual component has been added on, almost as an afterthought, and Heidegger doesn't see it that way. So he says that the response is that instead of humanism, we need to have a tradition in which the human being listens to being. It does not dictate to being, but listens to it and becomes the shepherd of being. So man should become in this tradition the shepherd of being. He needs to listen to being, and he needs to cultivate a relationship to being, take on a role in relationship to being that is much more passive, not active, not the Faustian aggression that came out of the humanistic tradition that led to the atrocities of the two world wars, but needs to cultivate a much more passive role to being. And basically Sloterdijk characterizes Heidegger as saying he basically means to put himself in the role of the priest of being, and those individuals who are like-minded will follow him or listen to him. But Sloterdijk points out that you can't construct a community out of this. It's an ontoanthropology. It's not a humanism, but you can't construct a community out of this. It isn't based on language as reading texts that have a civilizing effect on the human being at all. It's not based on that model. It's based more on the model of the shepherd, almost like Amos or Hosea, the shepherd out listening, who hears the call by God to go out and prophecy and philosophize and so forth. It's a completely different construction of these almost monk-like separated individuals that are separated from each other, listening, ear attuned to the call of being. Heidegger himself is its primary priest for now. And Sloterdijk sees this as not much of a model to build a civilization on. So that's how Sloterdijk characterizes then the letter on humanism of Heidegger. So then he moves on and says, the problem is, with Heidegger, what he overlooks, or what he doesn't go into, and what Sloterdijk will now proceed to go into, is the history of being in terms of, or the history of Gelassenheit, of releasement, that led to the process of the domestication of man and the realizations of being that have been civilization. He says that the place in which, for Heidegger, the place in which being is to become evident is precisely the clearing, die Lichtung, and the clearing is simply the mental space in which things become evident to the thinker. But Heidegger, Sloterdijk says, never did have, being distrustful of anthropology, he never did have a sense of the evolution of culture whereby the clearing came into being. And for Sloterdijk, the clearing came into being first with language, and the problem is with the human being, for Sloterdijk, is that the human being is born too early. The human being is an unspecified, indeterminate animal who, because he is born damaged, basically, he's a damaged animal, or an indeterminate animal, has to have a second coming into the world. In addition to the biological coming into the world, there has to be another coming into a world, and language facilitates that. So language is the means that connects human beings to each other and brings about the awakening of the human being into a second world. And neoteny is the basis for this. The reason why we have culture in the first place is precisely because the human being comes out uncooked. You have to finish cooking him in the oven of culture. And so with the Neolithic, and when people began to build actual physical buildings, Sloterdijk says, they began to domesticate the clearing, the space in which things became evident. You didn't just have language, but you also had the physical realization of being in houses now. And with houses comes into being the idea of the window, and originally the idea of doing theory was precisely analogized to looking out of a window. You look out of a window, that's a form of theoria, doing theory. So when civilization comes into being, we have theory building now that goes along with this, and we also have a change in the ontological status of animals. With the coming in of civilization and the evolution of the clearing, animals take on a new ontological status. They become pets. Human beings likewise take on a new ontological status. They become a kind of fancy pet. They become domesticated in a new kind of way that changes their ontological status. And so there's a biopolitical unity that Sloterdijk feels has been not remarked upon enough between animals, human beings, and houses. There's a basic biopolitical interrelationship there that not enough attention has been drawn to. And so we have these civilizations, we have them coming into being, we have the clearing coming into being, we have the human being becoming domesticated and being tamed through the civilizational process. And the civilizational process is, of course, this whole issue of the domestication of man, the taming of man. Man, for Sloterdijk, is the animal who tames himself, who is able to domesticate himself. And so now he reverts to further elucidate on this. He moves to Nietzsche, and specifically to the text, Thus Spake Zarathustra. I'm going to stop here and do a second half of this.